Having me. Again, my name is Greg Abbey, and I'm the Sustainability Program Developer within the Division of Public Housing here at EOHLC, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. Again, thanks so much for having myself and my colleague Gemma here today. I've got a bit of a presentation for you. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if this works. Okay. All right. Can folks see my screen okay?
Yes.
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 Okay, excellent. Great. So we'll talk about the different sustainability initiatives that EOHLC offers, the different programs that we administer. And so the agenda is, we'll talk a little bit about why all of this matters, and then what the different initiatives are. We'll do a little bit of myth busters towards the end, and then talk about some things that you can do. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So no worries to, I think it was Jada who said 12 o'clock was a hard stop. We'll be done well before that. So first, and I like to start with this just in case folks aren't super familiar, but really what we're talking about with global climate change is the greenhouse effect, right? Carbon dioxide, methane, bunch of different greenhouse gases go up into the atmosphere. The sun beats down on the earth, and normally a lot of that sunlight reflects and heat reflects back into space. But as we emit lots of greenhouse gases, we create a better blanket in the atmosphere, which retains more heat than it used to. And therefore, the atmosphere warms up, and we get all sorts of spillover effects from rising sea levels, stronger storms like we just saw in the southeast, and plenty of other things that we'll touch on momentarily. Talking about some stuff that's maybe as interesting as watching paint dry. There are a lot of different reasons to care about this, but just so you know, Massachusetts has a lot of legislation on the books to address climate change. We're one of the leaders in that space, which I think is really great, and it makes my job and Gemma's job a lot easier. Climate Bill S9 sets net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and that's for buildings, that's for vehicles, that's for industry, that's for the whole of the Massachusetts economy. It's a very aggressive goal. Our role within EOHLC is to help housing authorities comply with these different pieces of climate legislation. Executive Order 594, that was signed by Governor Baker a few years ago, and that at its most fundamental level says that executive agencies like us need to help lead by example. So with the different programs that we administer, with the funding that we use and send out, we need to be all rowing in the same direction in unison towards achieving these different climate goals. So in short, it's mandatory, but that isn't always the most compelling reason to care about these things. And so just one more thing I'll mention here on the resiliency front. And when we think about resiliency, really what we're thinking about is how do we help housing authority developments withstand different types of weather emergencies, and in particular, flooding from extreme rain, flooding from sea level rise and storm surge, and extreme heat, all three of which are becoming increasingly common, unfortunately. There are a couple of different state level initiatives. One is called SHMCAP, the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan, because as a civil servant, one of the most fun things we get to do is create acronyms that no one can really keep track of. But what it directs is state agencies to identify resilience vulnerabilities that they have within their kind of purview, their sphere of influence, and then make plans to try and address them. And so EOHLC, back when we were DHCD a few years ago, we did a study called CHARM, again, acronyms. But this resiliency study looked at all of the different developments within the state-funded public housing portfolio and looked to see what types of hazards they would be vulnerable to in the near term, but also say in 30, 40 years' time. And we wanted to start making plans when we do capital projects, say a roof replacement. If we expect that a development will be vulnerable to extreme heat in the near future, we'd like for that roof to be a lighter color to help reflect sunlight away, keep the interior spaces cooler, it keeps people more comfortable, and it reduces utility consumption because the air conditioning doesn't have to run quite as forcefully. So that's one of the things that we did in response to this initiative, and we'll talk a bit more in detail in just a couple of minutes. Some fun charts here. Up on the top right, these are observed increases in very heavy precipitation from 1958 to 2012. Basically, what that means is when it rains, and it rains hard, how much harder does it rain now than when it did back in 1958? And the answer is in 2012. And again, this is now 10 years out of date. But it rains, when it rains hard, it rains 71% harder than it did 50 years ago. So when it rains, it really pours, is the takeaway from that. And I think we're seeing that just last year and earlier this year, parts of central and western Mass flooded, not from some sort of tropical storm that comes through, just from torrential rain all of a sudden out of nowhere. Down in the bottom right, all those fun colors around downtown Boston, that's storm surge and sea level rise out a number of years. But you can see there are areas of Cambridge that get flooded. Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market are kind of down here in this little area, so they're vulnerable too. And even areas that are fairly far inland in, say, Fenway, because of the way that different bodies of water interact with one another, they can be vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge as well. And then up here in the top left, it's talking about the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is set for 2050. So you can see that inland, even in areas of higher elevation, you've got 21 to 27 days spent above 90 degrees. That is quite different from what we're accustomed to in a New England climate. That's more closely associated with what you might think of in, say, Pennsylvania, maybe Maryland. So things are already starting to happen, and we want to get ahead of it. But now for a fun little history lesson that I think also illustrates why caring about climate change matters. Hurricane of 1938. Anybody there? Don't answer. Just kidding. Just kidding. So way back, folks in Massachusetts, they cleared land, cut down all sorts of old growth forests in order to do agriculture. But over time, pine began to take over. This is when fields were abandoned because industrialization and industrial farming out in the Midwest was way more productive than all the rocky soil we have around here. And so as farmers abandoned their fields, pine forests began to take over and became the dominant species all across, certainly Massachusetts, but New England more generally. And then what happened was in 1938, a hurricane hit New England directly, came without warning, and it hit Vermont and New Hampshire as a Category 2 hurricane. So it didn't lose too much of its strength coming up over Connecticut and going into those areas. 186-mile-an-hour winds were recorded near Boston, and it killed about 600 people. And inland, the storm uprooted nearly 1,000 square miles of forest, mostly pine. Here's a picture from back in 1938. And again, it's because in the 17th and 18th centuries, all those farmers cleared huge areas of land for farming, and then pine was allowed to regrow afterwards. But after the pine blew down, what species of trees were freed up to grow sort of unimpeded by the shade of the pine trees? Maple, birch, and oak. Beautiful fall foliage. So part of the reason we've got fall foliage is because this hurricane blew through and knocked down all the pine trees that were stifling the growth of these more aesthetically pleasing deciduous trees. So why does this matter? It matters because as the climate changes, forests start to shift. You can kind of see the blue that's in upstate New York. It's all through Vermont and New Hampshire and out in the Berkshires and out in central Massachusetts. Those are the maple beech birch dominant forests. Beautiful fall foliage colors. The green that you see more down in sort of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, those are oak hickory, the dominant species in those regions. And so as the climate starts to change, and when I say that forests begin to shift, I don't mean that they shift like this. What I mean is that over time, the trees, say a storm comes through, knocks some trees down, maybe those trees don't recover quite as well because they're in a much warmer climate than they're accustomed to growing. Over time, the expectation is that it will move in this direction. So on the far left, we can see a lot of, now it's in red, maple beech birch being the dominant species. But by 2100, if we are able to get a hold of emissions, we'll still have a fair bit of this red maple beech birch dominating in Vermont, New Hampshire, Berkshires, Central Mass, etc. But if we don't get control of greenhouse gas emissions, then all of Massachusetts will shift to oak hickory being the dominant species. You can also see in Vermont, New Hampshire, other than maybe the high elevation, Green Mountains, White Mountains, it also shifts predominantly to oak hickory being the dominant species. And again, it's not like it will cause a mass die-off of maple beech birch. It's more like if something happens to those trees, they're less likely to recover, and the conditions are better for growing oak and hickory. So this is what oak hickory fall foliage looks like. It's fine. It's relatively pretty to look at, but it's not the same as this. So thank you for entertaining my hopefully not too long-winded ecology lesson. But the point here is, I think as folks living in the Northeast, this time of year in particular has sort of deep cultural roots. The trees start to change. Things look really pretty. It's apple season. You can go for a walk in the woods and feel the leaves crunch under your feet. But that's just something that the fall foliage will be nowhere near as vibrant in a uncontrolled climate future. So it's just a change in our cultural landscape. So let's talk about the different types of things that EOHLC can do to help housing authorities not just slow down and mitigate climate change, but also get ready to cope with the worst of its effects and also benefit indoor air quality as well. So we make funding awards to housing authorities that develop capital projects, building construction projects. That's most of our focus. And there are lots of different types of awards that we can make, but they're really focused on three main things. The first is greenhouse gas emission reductions. So there are lots of different ways that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in housing authority developments. But primarily, reducing energy consumption is one of the best ways of doing it. So it's adding more insulation to parts of the building that are currently uninsulated or under-insulated. It's also air sealing. If you've got lots of air leaks in and around the building, sealing those up. It's replacing heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment. And in particular, a focus these days is on electrification, moving away from fossil fuel fired equipment and replacing it with electric equipment. Because as the grid gets more renewable power added to it, anything attached to the grid will be using more clean power. It's also that housing authorities have the opportunity to install on-site solar on either rooftops, canopies over parking lots. If they've got a big vacant lot they're not planning on doing anything with, you could potentially put something mounted on the ground there. And those can feed right into a building And again, anything using electricity will be therefore cleaner than burning fossil fuels on site. So what we're trying to do is make sure that every type of improvement that a housing authority makes to their development is keeping greenhouse gas emissions in mind. If you're replacing siding, that's a perfect time to upgrade all of the insulation on the outside of that building. Perfect time to do it. The most expensive part of one of those projects is just taking the siding off and putting the new siding back on. The insulation is relatively cheap by comparison, and it's way more comfortable a building if it's better insulated for everybody living there. That's just one example of the types of projects that Gemma and I are constantly on the lookout for. Resiliency. What types of projects can we do here? Well, they're again, all different shapes and sizes. We're trying to make every type of improvement more resilient. I mentioned replacing roofs with lighter colored roofs, but that's not the only project type. It's things like, again, insulation on the outside of buildings. If you're replacing, let's say, doors, and the doors are below the design flood elevation, where you think in, say, a coastal community, it's reasonable to expect floodwaters could get to. There are certain types of doors that can cope with floodwaters better and are not damaged as much, as an example. Site improvements, making sure that when buildings have gutters that come off the building, that the gutters actually go away from the building, sending water away so that it can't flow back and go into the building and damage equipment, or go into the basement, or cause humidity inside the unit. So there's a lot of different things that we can help with there. And we're also going and trying to identify some of the most at-risk developments from that study I mentioned earlier, and try and do large-scale projects very quickly that will make those developments much more resilient in a faster timeline. So that's what our resiliency focus is. And again, we make funding awards to projects to help either completely cover the cost of doing the entire project, or paying for whatever the cost difference is between what you might normally do and something that's more resilient, something that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So where there's a cost difference, we can almost always help. And lastly, but no less importantly, is indoor air quality. The primary improvements that we help fund to buildings that address indoor air quality are improved ventilation, and that's through bath fans and range hoods. Bath fans, so that when you take a bath, you take a shower, it generates steam. You want to get that out of the building and away from building components. It's more pleasant to not be in a super humid space, and it prevents the growth of mold and other stuff like that inside bathrooms. And then range hoods ventilate cooking fumes. It also helps with, say, natural gas burning stoves. If you can get the fumes from just burning natural gas, open flames in the unit, out of the building, that's all the better. Another type of improvement we make on the indoor air quality front is replacing gas stoves with electric stoves. I think studies have come out in recent years that tie pretty closely asthma rates in children to the presence of natural gas cooking appliances inside smaller homes like apartments or condos. So the degree to which we can electrify stoves is of interest. The other thing that we found is, particularly with induction stoves, has anybody here ever seen or used an induction stove before? I'm seeing Helen with a nodding head yes. So we can talk about this a little bit later, but I'd be curious to hear folks' thoughts on induction stoves. Induction is different from a typical electric stove. Your normal one, it either has that spiral thing that always comes disconnected, or it just has sort of a flat panel that gets really hot. They tend to be tricky to cook with because when you turn the heat down, it doesn't immediately turn down. It takes a little bit to actually cool down. You can also burn your hand if you put something on there, and you can cause cooking fires if something overflows because you've got a really hot surface. Induction uses magnetic fields to heat up the pot or the pan, not heat up the surface. So you're much less likely to burn yourself, much less likely to catch things on fire, and it starts instantaneously. So if you turn the heat down, it is instantly down. It's like cooking with gas, but not with gas. And what I'm most interested in hearing a little bit later is folks' thoughts on cookware, because your cookware has to be magnetic to work with induction stoves. Some folks have it, and you can test it by just putting a magnet to the bottom of the pan. If it sticks, then it will work. But if it doesn't stick, then you would need all new pots and pans in order for it to work. We've heard of a couple of housing authorities who I think have figured out a way to compensate residents for cookware in instances where they've converted to induction stoves. And again, just a little bit later, I'd love to hear what folks' thoughts are on it. Last couple of things on indoor air quality. We have on our website something called the Healthy Building Network Resource Guide. It is a guide for housing authorities and for their staff to think about material purchases like, say, carpets or cleaning supplies that are less toxic. They're less harsh. They don't have as many chemicals in them that are unpleasant to breathe and, frankly, in some cases, unhealthy to breathe. And so that's a resource that is out there for anybody to use as they like. Just a few more slides here. There are other opportunities that housing authorities can take advantage of. The Mass Save Income Eligible program is one of the most readily used, and it's often called the LEAN program. Housing authorities or their residents can get energy-related improvements to their buildings at no cost through this program. It's great. Folks, if you haven't used it, you absolutely should, because everybody who pays an electric or gas bill, unless you live in a municipal light plant territory, everybody is paying into these programs. And they can do everything from insulation, air sealing, to HVAC improvements, and so on. There's also something called the Deep Energy Retrofit Program for those housing authorities that want to be really aggressive about reducing greenhouse gas emissions very quickly by doing a really big project, many millions of dollars project. There's a lot of funding that can go through that initiative, as well as through DOER, the Department of Energy Resources. They have big programs that target, again, we're talking 50% energy reduction or greater through one large improvement project. Few mythbusters. Fact or fiction? Is it possible to overseal a building? Let's see, show of hands, who thinks you can overseal a building? Okay. I think we've seen a majority of folks that I can see, and the answer is yes, that's correct, you can. It's hard to do, but you can do it. You can do what's called a blower door test. And I'll show you an image in just a second of what that looks like, but it measures the air leakage in a building, and you can dial in your air sealing efforts right to the edge where, okay, past this point, we have to mechanically ventilate the building. We've got to put in air intakes. We've got to set the bath fans to run, say, for 5 minutes an hour to move air around, whatever it is. So you can measure it. That's the takeaway. And ultimately, the less air leakage there is, the more efficient the building is, the less it costs to heat and cool, and the more comfortable it will be. But if you do the building too tight, you can install mechanical ventilation in order to make sure that everybody still has good indoor air quality. And this is what a blower door looks like. Basically, it's a fan mounted in a shroud. So you open the door to the outside and you mount this whole contraption inside of the door. It blocks the whole thing up. Then you put the fan in, and then you set the fan to either blow air into the building or suck air out of the building. And you can measure how much air is going through that fan at any given time. You can also walk around and feel where the air is coming in, and you know, okay, that's a spot that needs to get sealed up. Myth. There's nothing you can do about high utility costs. It's the utility companies. They're just raising rates on people. They're ripping everybody off and so on. The good news is there are ways for both housing authorities and residents to take control of their energy costs. Here are a few different ways. For residents paying their own bills, there are discount rates that are available from the utility companies. You would be surprised how many instances we hear of folks who pay their own electric bill, their own gas bill, but they're not on the discount rate. The discounts can be pretty sizable. They can be 50% or greater per, say, kilowatt hour of electricity from what the standard rate is. And it's pretty easy to find their different websites. If you want the information, I can send it to you as well. I think I made a thing of QR codes some time ago that folks can just scan with a phone, and it will bring you straight to the particular utility company's application. There's also something called a heat deduction schedule. For residents who pay their own electric and gas bills, they can receive a heat deduction at rent determination. That's something that they would do with their housing authority staff. And that information had not been updated in a long time. We, HLC, recently updated this. We basically doubled where it had been for a long time. And we also added an extra heat deduction on top of the standard one for residents who heat with electric heat. What we were finding is, in our efforts to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if you go from gas to electric, you can run the risk, if you're not careful, of increasing the overall cost of heating, let's say. And so this extra deduction is to help shield residents from potential increases in their utility costs if you go from gas to electric. And then housing authorities, again, a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about, from insulation, air sealing, replacing aging equipment, all of that can help reduce utility costs. But there are also ways that you can do on-site solar right on the property itself, or that you can sign up for community solar, where it's on the side of a highway, or maybe it's part of a capped landfill, but you are buying the power coming out of that array. It's not the electrons that get beamed to you, but you get to claim credit for it. And typically you're locked into a contract with a reduced rate for a period of time. So those are all ways that both housing authorities and residents can keep control of their utility costs. So what are some things that you all can do? Again, I think that we're probably all on the same page here, but climate change continues to get worse, and there are health and economic and cultural and ecological impacts that go along with that, whether it's flooding, extreme heat, changes in cultural landscape like downtown Boston, some of the historic buildings being flooded, or fall foliage slowly changing and going away over time. And housing authorities and their residents have a role to play. Every type of improvement that is being done in a building, there's probably something that can be tweaked just a little bit to make it more resilient, to keep the buildings more comfortable, to improve the indoor air quality, and or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the best ways is to just get involved. Ask me, ask housing authority staff, ask anybody you can get a hold of what more can be done to address these important issues. And there's a lot of new technology that's out there, whether it's heat pumps, which we talked about a little bit, and we can go into a little more detail in just a moment. But with these new technologies, there's a bit of a learning curve, and we're here to help navigate that learning curve and figure out what can be done to address adoption of new technology, because a lot of it is really exciting and holds a lot of potential and is working pretty well. But where things are new, we want to help navigate that. So that's my speech. Any questions that folks have, I am happy with Gemma's help to answer. And with that, I'll stop sharing my